This is my tutorial on making a racetrack from scratch. And what we're going to do in this tutorial is we're going to use a challenge maker to make our own racetrack from scratch. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, the racetrack they provide us in the game is very good. It has AI and everything, but you can't put any jumps or breaks in the track. You can't really race everything you want to on this track. It's just a racetrack. So what we're going to do is build a race that anything could race in. You could take your flying characters, flying vehicles, anything at all can fly in this, as long as you build the course to accommodate it. So I'm going to show you the logic behind making this all work. Now, as you see, I've already laid out some logic around this challenge maker. This is the logic we're going to need to make this event work. I haven't actually hooked it up yet. We're going to do that in this tutorial. I just thought I'd lay it out to make it a little quicker to get through. So, I'll show you the basics. In this section here, we have a simple piece of logic that is going to count how many players are in our event. And I want to do that because I don't want to make it a simple challenge where as soon as the first person crosses the finish line, the game stops. I want it more like a real racing event where every player gets to finish. And to do that, I have to know how many players are playing. And once I know how many players are playing, I'm going to use a logic chain right here to point at these four counters. And these four counters are basically, a logic chain is a lot like a switch. And what we're building here is a 4-position switch. And each position is pointed at a counter for the different number of players. This is 1 player, 2 player, 3 player, 4 player. And what we're going to do is we're going to use these counters over here to figure out how many people are in the game, to set the switch to the right amount of players. And these counters are going to be counting every time a person finishes their final lap. It'll increment by 1 to whichever counter is active. And so if it's, say we're on a 3-player game, once this counter reaches 3 people have finished the lap, it knows the game is over and it's going to end the challenge. And then down here we have our actual race logic, and we'll get to that later. First we're going to start at how do we count how many people are playing in the game. What we're going to do is, down here you'll see I've got 2 trigger areas. This is the starting position where all the players are going to start. Each of these locators is already hooked up to a player start. So I believe it's player 1, player 2, player 3, player 4. And they're all in this one trigger area. So what I'm going to be saying is when any player enters this trigger area, I'm going to send an input to this logic gate. And I'm only using this logic gate mostly as a central point so I can do all my logic from it. And what I'm going to say is I'm never going to open or close this logic gate, and it defaults open, so the output is going to increment by 1 this counter. What this is doing is this counter is going to be set to 2 players. This counter is going to be set to 3 players. And this counter is going to be set to 4. Now the reason I don't need a counter set to 1 is because my logic chain over here, which is the switch, is by default going to be pointed at the counter for 1 player only. So I don't need to know if there's 1 player, I just need to know if there's more than 1 player, so I can start to close and open these logic gates to point at the proper counter. So I took the input from this, and I incremented by 1 each of these counters. What I'm going to say is this is going to be our logic chain, and so we're going to hook them together by input block. What we are going to do here is we are going to send an input every time someone finishes a final lap into this logic chain by hitting the input of this gate. So by default we're in a 1-player game. So by default this gate is open. So I'm going to say if this gate is open, send an output of increment plus 1 to the first counter. Alright, so the first counter is set to 2. So if 2 players enter this trigger area, we want to set a 2-player game. So we'll say if the target is reached, we will close this first logic gate. So now an input comes in, this one's closed, so it goes to this one. If this one is open, that means we're in a two-player game. So we'll say, if this one's open, then the output of this logic gate will increment by 1 the second counter. Now, this counter is set to 3 players, so if we get 3 players in the trigger area, we'll say, if the target is reached, close this logic gate. Now, I won't say close this one, because if we hit 3 players, we already hit 2. So now the input will come in the first, in the second, and in the third, which is still going to be open. So we're going to say this one's open, so we'll send an output of this gate to increment plus 1 of the third counter. Now if we hit all 4 players, we'll say target reached, and then we'll close the final logic gate. And that means that the input blocked of the final one will increment by 1 the final counter. Every time someone finishes their final lap, we're going to get an input, and when the counter is reached, we want to end the game. So we'll say when target is reached, complete the game. So next we will move on to the level starter. It is set to point at the trigger area, and when it goes off right now, it's deactivating this trigger area. I want this trigger area to almost always be off. So what I want to happen is when invites are accepted, I want to activate this trigger area. And when the game starts, I want to deactivate it again. Now I'm doing this because the invites accepted happens right before your character is moved to its start location. So I want it to turn on just before you move into this trigger area and turn off as the challenge is starting. What I want to happen is when the game is over, I'm going to use results closed. I'm going to open this logic gate over here. And what I've done already is I've tied these logic gates together, so when this one opens, it opens the middle one, and when that middle one opens, it opens the last one. So after the scoreboard has gone away, these will all open ready for the next challenge. I also want to use results closed to reset all 7 of the counters that are up here. I need them all closed. So now we have it so that when the game is over, all this logic will be cleared and ready for the next challenge. So now we have to move on to the race itself. You'll see here I have some logic gates, and then more logic gates over here, and some more logic gates over here, and some counters. Now these logic gates will be tied to this trigger area, which is our lap trigger area. These ones on the right will be tied to our first checkpoint trigger area, and the logic gates on the left will be tied to the second checkpoint trigger area. So what these will do is control our race. How this race is going to work is that when the race starts, I'm going to close the logic gates for this first trigger area. Actually, I should probably just do that now. I have to keep track of every player separately from this point on. So player 1 will send an input to this logic gate, and I got to do the rest as well. So I just tied all 4 players to these logic gates. So player 1 inputs there, player 2 inputs there, player 3 inputs there, player 4 inputs there. So when these receive an input, if they are closed, they will tell the next checkpoint's logic gate for the same player to close. Because we're going to do all of the outputs out of input blocked. So if you pass through a checkpoint and you haven't closed it by passing through the checkpoint before, nothing will happen. So what we want to do is say if the input is blocked because it has to be closed, we will go to player 1 over here and we will tell it to close. Now, once we close it, we want the old one to open again so nothing happens. So we'll say, if you close, we want to open the logic gate for checkpoint 1. So, and then we're going to do the exact same thing for the rest of them, for the rest of the players. Now, I'm also going to attach this trigger area to the input of the logic gates for checkpoint 2. And again, I'll have to do it for all the players. So I'll do player 1 is the input. So we want to do the same thing where if this one gets an input block for player 1, we will tell the lap trigger area to close for player 1. So we'll do that. We'll say input blocked from player 1's logic gate. We'll close this logic gate. And when it closes, again, we want it to open the logic gate for checkpoint 2's player 1. So next we want to make sure we attach this trigger area players to the input of their associated logic gate. So that's player 1. So now we need the input blocked of the lap logic to close the logic gate for checkpoint 1's logic to make sure we can do another lap. So we'll be doing the exact same logic where we'll take input blocked from this first logic gate and send it to player 1's logic gate for the first checkpoint, and then we will say when you close, open the checkpoint logic gate. So what we have done is said that when the logic for the first checkpoint is closed, when we hit it, it will tell the logic gate for the next area to close, which will reopen our first logic gate for this area. So then when we travel along, when we hit the next one, it will tell the lap checkpoint logic to close, which will tell the logic for this checkpoint to reopen. And then when we travel over to the lap area, it will tell the first checkpoint to close, which will reopen the lap area logic, and so on and so on. It'll keep going. We have a nice little chain going on. But if they're all open by default, how will we set the first checkpoint to close? Well, that's pretty simple. We're going to use the invites accepted of the challenge maker to close all 4 of these logic gates. Now, we also need to do something when we lap, or this game will never end. Well, that's what this counter over here is for. So every time we hit a lap, so when we have the input blocked from our lap logic, we're going to increment this counter by 1. And we want this counter set to 3 because that's how many laps we're going to do when we're racing. So whenever you go around the lap once, twice, 3 times, and then the count will trigger. We also need to do the rest. We have to have the rest of the logic the same. Now, how do we tell the player what lap they're on? I've tried text creators and other things, and text creators and challenge makers sometimes don't get along so well. So what we're going to use is this scoreboard over here. And we're going to use the scoreboard to keep track of what lap you are currently on. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say when invites are accepted, we're going to reset the score on this scoreboard. And then we're also going to say when the game is started, we will activate this scoreboard. So we are going to tell our player every time they lap. We'll send an input block from the lap logic gate, because this sends a message every time we successfully complete a lap. And we're going to send that to increment the player's score by 1. That's one more lap you've done. Alright, so now everyone will know how many laps they've done. The scoreboard's not important to this challenge, it's just showing how many laps you've done. We're actually going to use a timer to determine results. But when we end the game, so results closed, we want to clear these counters that were counting our players' laps. So we still need the logic for these counters. When these counters reach their target, they will send a target reached message up here to this logic chain that we first built. This will be counting how many players so far have finished their last lap, so the counter up here can decide when everyone is complete and end the game. And we have to do that for each of the counters. They're all going to input into the same logic chain. We want this race to be scored by a timer, so we want to do a time result link to this timer. We also want the challenge maker to be set so that result score is time, and we want low to high because the fastest time wins. So in the timer, we want count down from target time to be off because we want the time to go up in the race. We also don't need to change the timer time because we won't be doing anything from the timer's logic for this game. We're just using the timer for its time. What we will do is say when results are closed, we will reset this timer. And when the challenge is started, we will start the timer. Now, when the results are closed, resetting the timer, I don't know if that's a great plan. I'll probably change that to game ended, but we'll try it for now. I also want to know when each individual person finished the race. So I'll say that when this counter is target reached, I'm going to log that player's completion so the challenge knows correct time for this player in the race, and I'll do that for everyone. And that would be it. That is all the logic you need to make a race that you can race pretty much anything in. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. I might put up another video of me testing this race, but this tutorial's gone on long enough, so have a great day, and I hope the race works for you.